It is a special pleasure for me. First of all, I'm Gabriel Motzkin. I'm the director of this institute. It's a special pleasure for me tonight to introduce Professor Nilufer Gole, who is one of the leading experts on secularization and modernity anywhere. And I've had the pleasure for years of reading her work, of hearing her speak, and of seeing her research develop. She is, of course, a prominent Turkish sociologist, but is today Directeur de Recherche in Paris at the École des Hautes Études. And in addition, she's the author of The Forbidden Modern, Civilization and Veiling, and Islam in Europe, The Lure of Fundamentalism, and the Allure of Cosmopolitanism. And she brings the special perspective of someone who does not endlessly worry about how did modernity emerge from Christianity, and what do people do about modernity that in fact are not Christian. Monotheists, but not Christian. But there's another issue I would like to direct to your attention, and that is an issue which is perhaps best described by the terms iconoclastic and iconodulic, i.e. the idea of visibility or seeing and what that means. What is invisible? Because in our traditions, God is invisible, and Islam, so is the female, the woman. And is she invisible because she is more sacred or more profane? And what happens to the categories of sacrality and profanity in a secular culture where at the same time you believe that the laws of the world are hidden, but you are compelled as a result of modernity to try to want to see everything, to have everything unveiled. I think these are issues which we do not always think about in terms of our quiet comfort in our modern context, but they make sense to think about them anew from the perspective of people who come from other traditions than that of Western Europe and how they encounter it. And so Professor Göle will speak to us tonight about the disruptive visibility of Islam in European publics, political issues, theoretical questions. Please.
Thank you. Maybe I'll come and follow your footsteps. Thank you very much for your participation, and my special thanks to the Van Leer Institute and to Professor Gabriel Motzkin to invite me. And it couldn't have been more timely. I traveled on the 10th anniversary of the commemoration of the September 11th, and especially the moment that Israeli-Turkish relations are getting very tense, if I may just use the word tense, nothing more than that. And the title I have chosen, it was really The Disruptive Visibility of Islam, and I think there is something disruptive about it, and I'll try to communicate this to you and exchange maybe later. First, let me start with a story. I was 17 in a youth camp in Portugal at Figueira da Foz, for those who know a little bit about Portugal. And this was the first time I was out of Turkey and meeting other European youngsters of my age. I was chatting with an Israeli boy when a French student interrupted my conversation with him and blamed me of being hostile to the Israeli state and making part of the Arabo-Muslim world. I was appalled because I myself, as a Turkish, we were very proud of recognizing the Israeli state as being one of the first Muslim states of recognizing Israeli state, and we almost thought this was an insult to be identified with the Arabic Islamic world for the Turks. So this was also the first time I was experiencing the gap between my own self-perception, the historical narrative in which I was raised, and the European perception of Turks. This was really a big surprise to me. I was brought up in a secular republican state, making part of the generation of what we called daughters of Atatürk, And so therefore Turkish national identity was based upon the pillars of secularism and Westernism, and not on those of religion, Islam, and the Orient. Amnon Krakotskin is with us. He and Gil Anidjar has shown for the Jewish case how there was an attempt to sharply distinguish the Jew as a European from the Oriental as a way of assimilating her into the West. This was a story for Turks, although maybe a failure. But in the Turkish case, we really, like Jews, Turks have tried to distinguish themselves, to separate themselves from the Arab Oriental world, to join what we used to call the Western civilization. For that reason, we had a series of regimes of forgetting. We changed our alphabet, for instance, calendar. Until very recently, until a certain age, I didn't know that Sunday was not a neutral date, but very Christian. I thought it was secular. And so we were joining the Western calendar. So all these changes in the case of Turkey, it was also a kind of a regime of forgetting the Ottoman past, Islamic heritage, and making part of the desire of making part of the Western world. The incident I have referred was in 1970s, 3 years later than the 6-year war. But since then, things have changed radically. First, the abstract sense of belonging to the West for Turks, because we thought we belonged to the West and not to that region, Middle East. In that sense, I will call it abstract. It came to an end with a disappointment of the failed membership in European Union. We faced the real making part of this process of Westernization, which started before the Turkish Republic in 1923, well before, during the Ottoman Empire, the reformists of the Ottoman Empire, positivists, les jeunes Turcs, the young Ottoman movements. So for Turks, the European Union was just the culmination of their process of Westernization. It was almost like just a natural process. But the questioning of the legitimacy of the membership of Turkey for the European Union was a surprise. Not only the problems that required to be solved, like human rights question, Armenian recognition of the Armenian genocide, or Kurdish issue, there was lots of issues, but this was not the issue. The issue was whether Turkey had this possibility, the justification to be a member of the European Union. So I think this abstract sense of belonging to the Western world, civilization, came to an end. And secondly, amnesia of the past, that is this Ottoman heritage that we didn't want to take, and the revival of Islam started being on the forefront. So recognition of non-Muslim minorities, but also, as I just referred, the demons of the historical past, massacres, genocides, population exchanges with non-Muslim minorities. These are all now on the fore stage in Turkish politics. But this would mean, as well, the loss of hegemony of the Western secular in Turkey, and the emergence of Islam as a constitutive force, both in terms of identity but also politics. This is what I mean by disruptive effect. So Turkey considered, as we know, as a bad Muslim because of the secularization it passed through in the eyes of Arabs until very recently, and the ally of the United States and Israel, now emerges almost as a reference, as a role model among the Arabic countries. Even though it is questioned, it is in the conversation. Can Turkey be a role model for the Arab Spring or not? So there is a really important paradigmatic shift in terms of belonging, and here Islam plays a very important constitutive as well as disruptive role. So the difficult conjuncture that we are experiencing today between Turkey and Israel is related to this emergence of religion in global politics and the paradigmatic shift. And I think in that sense, the conjuncture that we are witnessing is very much related with what I called the disruptive effect of Islam, not only in European publics, but in general, for Turks as well. So now let me move more to the European public sphere. What I mean by emergence of Islam in European public sphere is the way different European publics started to debate on the presence of Islam, the controversies around Islam. There's not one reason. First of all, it was related with Turkish membership. The first time European countries started to think about their European identity as an identity was related with the Turkish membership. So the debate over frontiers, they were saying, if we accept Turkey, what about the frontiers of Europe? And here what we meant by the frontiers was both geographical, but especially civilizational. The word civilization entered into the public agenda with the book of Clash of Civilizations of Professor Huntington, but also with the Turkish membership in the European political and public vocabulary. It entered saying that it's a different civilization, doesn't make part of Europe. If we take Turkey into European Union, this would mean the end of singularity of Europe. This would mean the end of Christian Europe. So I think Turkish membership can be considered as a catalyst for debating European identity in the European Union. What is European identity about? Second issue related with Muslims is Muslim migrants. So again, it's outside, inside, because Turkey can be kept outside, but there is the migrant issue. Turks as well, they are both members, but also migrants to Europe. So Muslim migrants brought, especially in majority, the issues related with Islam being part of the European public life through signs and symbols. I will come to that. But also there is the Muslim past in Europe, that is in relation to Spain and in Bosnia. So European Muslims and ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. So this also brought the issue of convert citizens, convert from Christianity to Islam, but also to revert citizens, revert meaning those Muslims who went back to those in Spain who were no longer Muslims went back to Islamic religion. So there were many ways that Islam was becoming, in the contemporary public sphere, a debate. There are three main issues that made Islam visible. That is the issue of visibility in the public arena. One is related with veiling, all related with Islamic prescriptions. Islamic covering of women, what I'll call veiling, although it's not face veil, but can take different forms, the headscarf, to total veiling, which is called burqa. Okay? So women's veiling, students' veiling, that is covering their heads and attending public schools, especially in France. This was a very important debate, which ended up with a ban, with a law that banned the Islamic headscarf from the public schools. But now later, the total veiling from the streets in France. And this ban is getting generalized. Second is construction of mosques and minarets. And you know this one is also related in a very unexpected way from Switzerland, a referendum that banned the construction of minarets. And there are a lot of mosques, but the issue is what kind of a mosque and where. So the construction of mosques also triggered a very important public debate. And third, which is now becoming more an issue, is halal food and ritual slaughtering. So I have in mind these three very empirical examples since the last maybe 10 years or so, becoming more and more European. So it can start in France, but it travels to different contexts. And in some places, it is more the construction of mosques, which is debated. And in other cases, it is the Islamic veiling. Or in other contexts, it is halal food. But in every country, these debates are recurring and most often ending up with also legislation, trying to control it, to ban it from the public sphere. Now, first of all, what is the issue of visibility? What I mean by visibility? When a symbol or a sign, religious sign, become visible to us, that means become a public issue. Become a public issue, that means we are worried. We feel maybe threatened. We feel disturbed. It can question our common values. So when a religious sign becomes visible, I think this is important. We can ask the question. Because crosses in the public schools in Germany is not visible for German citizens. They consider it as part of their cultural heritage. When in discussions on multiculturalism, people said there are many migrant students who wouldn't be in a public school under a cross, who wouldn't appreciate being in a class. This is not a neutral space. Then Germans said, this is our cultural heritage. And some migrants said also, for us, cross is a cultural symbol. It is not a religious symbol. So when it becomes religious, when it is cultural, and when it is political. This is one issue, because the category of religion is not fixed. It depends also on the perceptions. So the Islamic veiling of girls were not considered as a sign of piousness, but of political Islam. Mostly. They said, this is not about Islam, this is about political Islam. This is not about religiosity. And the example I often give, this was also the secularist argument in Turkey, they were saying, we like the headscarf of our grandmothers because they are innocent, they are in a space, they are sitting on a chair, knitting for their grandchildren. So this is the image of a pious woman at home. Or the headscarf of the working class, migrant working class, suburban, periphery, finding themselves at the periphery of the cities, were not visible. There were many people carrying the headscarf, also coming from Eastern countries, but also Muslims. But this was not an issue. It became visible when they entered into new places, spaces of modernity like schools. So this is important. Transgression, spatial, what I call, sorry for the jargon, spatial transgression. There was a transgressive effect in terms of entering into spaces that were not reserved for foreigners or reserved to those newcomers. Or if you enter into that space, you should be assimilated. You should adopt a strategy of hiding your difference. This is the definition of secularism, the French notion of secularism. If you come into this space, leave your difference behind, your kippas, veiling, and crosses. That is all about the law. The ostentatious signs, the word ostentatious is very interesting. So what is ostentatious is very culturally determined. What seems very natural to me can be very ostentatious to you. My hair maybe, or my nose, but okay. Who knows? What is ostentatious? So the law used the word ostentatious, saying all religious ostentatious signs will be prohibited from the spaces of public school, because space is defined, secularism is defined as neutrality, as if there can be neutrality. And therefore leaving behind your differences. Therefore you need to be assimilated. Hide your religious difference. So I think first issue of space, same thing for mosques. Because mosques, we have lots of mosques in Europe, but they were basically at the basement. You cannot recognize it as a mosque. You don't have any singularity. It's praying rooms. And being at the basement became also a problem for European politicians, saying we should take it out of the basement for security issues, transparency. We should know what is going on in these mosques, to control, to have a control. It's a closed space. So we should give the possibility for the construction of mosques, and then starts the problems. What kind of a mosque? Shall we just take the duplication of a mosque in Istanbul, or from Morocco to Paris? Or should there be a kind of aesthetics which would be considered as a European mosque? Is a minaret and a dome is a must for a mosque? It is not. It is not an issue of sacred. It is totally cultural. But singularity, how we recognize a mosque, or how we hide it. So once it becomes recognizable, it can be disturbing. Once it is in the middle of the city, it is competing with cathedrals, like in the case of Cologne in Germany, very important cathedral, which is the marker of the city. And now there will be one of the biggest mosques right across the cathedral. This required, of course, a very important debate. If you accept that marker in the landscape, marking the presence of Muslims, but also over the space, is a power. How you handle it, you need negotiation. So visibility is about power, but it's also about space. When these mosques are far away, in industrial zones, we do not see them, it doesn't matter. What I mean, when it becomes a public issue, it becomes a concern for us, for all of us, for all citizens. If it's constructed in a region where only Muslims live, it is not a public issue. It's an issue of a community, and we don't see them. We are separated. That was the understanding of multiculturalism, a kind of avoidance of each other, cultural avoidance. That's why it is criticized now. The issue, when I raise it in terms of public, means when there is no more wall between differences, but we meet with each other in proximity. When the Muslim is our neighbor, what we do with that. When he wants to construct the mosque nearby the cathedral, not in the industrial zone and in the basement. Of course, this provokes a very important societal debate. But then, to ban the minaret is also very meaningful, the way they handled in Switzerland. Third is halal food. I give it because it should also resonate with kosher food. Halal food and ritual slaughtering. It's important. Halal food, instead of also taking it in the frame of language of minority rights. Well, if you are a religious minority, you have the right to choose your halal food. Even on the plane, you can choose kosher food, whatever you want. But it starts joining a societal debate. Like in the case of veiling, it is not about rights of minorities, religious minorities, but it is about gender equality, veiling today. So halal food is not about minority rights, dietary habits. It is about animal rights because of ritual slaughtering. What is criticized is ritual slaughtering, which is against the animal rights. Although ritual slaughtering in Judaism and in Islam is very close. So be careful. There can be problems also with kosher food once they start banning. Huh? There are already, yes, okay. We are coming. So I think what I mean by space issue is also this market, because then it becomes a concern for all. There were campaigns saying, I don't want to be served halal food where animals were not respected, so showing children and so on. So it joins the societal debate. That's what I'm trying to say. First of all, these debates become public, meaning it becomes part of a larger debate which concerns not only Muslims, but Muslims and non-Muslim citizens. So veiling issue is not, they are Muslim, they can do it. No, it is against our core values like gender equality. Halal food, we don't want it because it's against our understanding of animal rights, for instance, and this and that. So in that sense, Islam is becoming a public issue and controversial issue triggering a debate on the core values of Europe. Secondly, or third, there is issue of belonging and loyalty, because these migrants are belonging to several publics and nations and language communities. They can switch between different languages, but also when you construct a mosque, you are related with other networks. So there is this suspicion of loyalty and financial support, and it's the security aspect, but it's also an issue of loyalty. And I think can be also addressed to Jewish origin citizens in Europe, if they have more loyalty to Israel or to other countries. I think this issue of loyalty is also today more and more challenged by transnational sense of communications. And in a way, all these migrant people are much more related with transnational ties, but although this politics of suspicion, what I call. So coming to a more theoretical level of visibility and invisibility, so I'm arguing, therefore, that visibility is a form of public agency. And it's in the sense of not Habermas, who puts the emphasis on discursive practices in the public sphere, rational discursive practices, whereas Hannah Arendt has put the emphasis on the performative emphasis that I draw my inspiration. Because she's the one who would say, to be a citizen, one must have the courage to make oneself appear with one's differences and particularities in the public. I think this is about public agency. So there is a form of agency in making yourself visible in the public sphere to each other. And of course, this would mean also performative, like in Judaism, Islam, is the essence of Islam is about performance also. It is not only discursive and ideas, but what you do. So this, therefore, without the speech community even, there is this performative aspect which changes already the social imaginaries. It is not ideological and discursive, but social imaginaries in the sense of Castoriadis, who would speak about the history making through social imaginaries. Why? Because the performance in the public sphere change our social imaginaries. In the imaginaries we have images. So performances changes our images. Public praying in front of a cathedral of Muslims change our conceptions and imaginaries, for instance. So in this sense, I would say the visibility becomes a form of changing public life and challenging questions. I have time. Oh, thank you. And but visibility has some kind of ironies as well, some kind of its own paradoxes with religious norms. Let me draw some of them. It's interesting because on the one hand, as a citizen, you make yourself visible or you hide, because it's not always strategy of visibility, but you play with strategies of visibility and invisibility. For instance, in traveling, I would have liked to hide my place of birth these days, which is Ankara, okay, and bring forth my French identity. It depends. You might have strategies of visibility and invisibility. And 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, when I was coming to Israel, I preferred to say I am Turkish, proud, and not Arabic. And now things are changing. So there are always ways of hiding and strategies of visibility and invisibility, depending on the conjuncture. But for Muslims, there are paradoxes of this visibility. First is in relation to, I take the examples, veiling. Because the veiling as a Islamic prescription is normally a kind of monitoring yourself, self-disciplining of your sexuality for modesty. So it is related with piousness, but also modesty. It's both religious and in relation to nefs, that is this self-disciplining. So normally you have to avoid the gaze, whereas today, if you are veiled, you attract the public gaze. You are under the spotlight. So something which normally should hide you, keep you away from the public gaze, brings you to under spotlight. On the contrary, there is some overexposure of visibility. So this is one paradox with the religious prescriptions, visibility and modesty. And another example is mosques, because for for prayers, for pious people, not mosques, for the prayer already, for a pious person, it is important the concealment of piety. You shouldn't show it. It is considered in Islamic religion a riya, hypocrisy, to show it, because you might not have the piety, but just show it to the others. So this visibility of piety is also a source of suspicion among the religious pious people. Some of the Sufi orders go to a certain radical standpoint to totally hide their piety and do their praying in ankashet, in hiding themselves. So whereas now praying becomes, in European public spaces, a form of agency, both collective and personal, like convert citizen in Spain in front at Granada, who prayed so that he was making a statement, asking for a place of praying and so on, but also making appear Islam as a religion in the public sphere. But this can also enter into contradiction with the very essence of religion in the eyes of some pious people. Again, the mosques. Mosques, according to some, it should singularize Islamic culture. Therefore, it is good to have domes and minarets, but then if the form becomes too big and ostentatious, as we see now everywhere in the world, it becomes not a sign of piety, but a sign of power over the land. So I think all these issues of visibility and invisibility are issues that are related with ways of being in public, but also preserving your piousness in public. So there's always, everything we speak about publicness is related with your self, religious self, and your perceptions of piousness. So there is this contradiction in sometimes strategies for visibility can enter into contradiction with spirituality and faith. Now, in theoretical terms, I have two more points. One is theoretical and the other one is political. I said theoretical issues, theoretical questions, political issues. Theoretical question is, I would say, it is very much related with what is this disruptive effect of Islamic visibility in the European public space. I think I have shown in terms of the debates, both for Muslims and religion and for Europeans. It is questioning some of the core values of secular modernity as they are defined in contemporary societies, in which gender issue is at the forefront, secularism is defined in a particular way, and so on. But also, I think what is changing at a more theoretical level is the Islamic presence in contemporary Europe is changing space-time understanding of this public space. That is, because I will call it chronotope, which in Bahtin there is this notion of chronotope for literary studies. It is interesting, chronotope, because it is both the space and the time articulation. And I think this presence of Islam brings to this secular modernity, there is the secular chronotope, I would call, a different meaning and possible articulations between private and public. Because even the notion of private and public, as we were discussing today in the morning seminar, is derived from a very Christian and Western culture. Whereas if you translate it into Hebrew, Turkish, you don't find the exact meaning, private, public. It has a different meaning. Private, for instance, in the Turkish Islamic case at least, has a sense of secrecy, sacredness. It is not just individual private. It has a sense of hiding. That is related with veiling, is that therefore it is the secret, sacred, how you protect yourself from the anonymous gaze, maybe, for women. So today, I think the secular chronotopes, this time-space dimensions, are challenged because, first of all, the contemporary time, the present, for religious people, there is not one single time which is present, because the modern time really put the accent on the present. A colleague of mine François Hartog calls it présentisme. So it is so much, we live so much in the present, so even it is cut off sometimes from the past and from the future. But for religious, it is multi-layered. Time dimension is different. So Muslims, for instance, feel themselves connected to the chains of the memory of the Prophet. So it's a different way of living in the present. It's not only afterlife, but the way they live in the present, they already carry chains of continuity, of the longue durée. And also the issue of space, I think, is challenged. By bringing religious signs and symbols, it's not only the recognition of ethnically different other or religiously different other, but transforming your very notions of the space that is neutral. Because secular public space meant this neutrality and flattening, whereas I think the religious reminds us of the sacredness and the private sacredness in the public sphere. So it is not the exposure. That's why the feminism is at the heart of these debates, because this idea of enlightenment and exposure of the self and the emancipation from all traditions as a way of being in public. Your self-enactment in public is not the same model for religious pious people. So what I am proposing is to think of as an alternative to secular modernity, and of course in tribute to Shmuel Eisenstadt, with whom I started to think about multiple modernities, is a way of rethinking on this chronotope, maybe changing in our conceptions of space and time, private and public in today. Last issue is about political. Coming back to the Jewish issue. Let me come and take risks. That's adventure, intellectual adventure. I think Jewish issue, Jewish question in Europe, I'm still in Europe, is a cursor, a marker between Europe and Islam, is becoming more important than ever in many ways. So let me say in which ways it's becoming a marker, a cursor in the encounter between Europe and Islam. First, politics of memory. And I think there is no Europeanness, European citizenship, without knowing, learning, and recognizing the Shoah. So Muslim migrants, if they are evacuating the problem on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but as European citizens, they have to come to terms with Shoah. That's important. It is almost a condition to be, it's not just imposed from above. I'm saying as in the public life, and to be part of the European citizen, they have to take into hands, come to terms with Shoah. Already, politics of memory is related a lot with ways of naming things. As you know, Shoah is a French word as well. It's used in the French public. I'm sorry, it's not a French word. It's used in the French public. Whereas in English, it is used, it's not used. It's Holocaust, basically. It's the film of Lanzmann who made it widely circulated and well known in France. And there's a new, for your information, a new debate in France to take off this word Shoah from the textbooks because it is considered as a foreign word. That's why I said it's a French word. That was my lapsus. Well, and there was an article first, Lanzmann defending Shoah, and other one, more humoristic, making a list of foreign words in French, and saying that then we should take off all these foreign words. So the way we name is very important. And this brings me to Armenian genocide. So as is in Europe, we're going to have one politics of memory, Shoah, or do we have another ways of multiple memories, politics of memory? And I think we had always this gesture, automatism, of just subordinating the Armenian genocide to Shoah, as if we don't have to discuss about it. There is no need for putting a different name, like Metzgegen in Armenian. Some of the Turkish intellectuals have written a letter asking to be forgiven by the Armenian citizens, and naming it Metzgegen in Armenian, big catastrophe. Trying to name it Why? Because again, instead of a very maybe loaded but still very universalist kind of word like genocide that people are not capable of linking themselves, a word which is more particular can trigger much more reaction and also appropriation, because this was also the Anatolian affair. So making things remember for each history would really require a different politics of memory. And also, of course, I have started with Bosnian European Muslims, and in the case of Bosnia, I think we have forgotten to commemorate the fall of the Mostar Bridge, which is a very important moment in terms of the failure of European Muslims to be part of Europe from the past. And it is in the archives. We renewed it, but I think among the two symbols that can make Europe is one is the fall of Berlin Wall, and the other one is Mostar Bridge. One is hideous, the other one is a piece of art. One brings people together, Mostar Bridge. The wall separates people, but in the minds, in the collective memory of Europeans, it is the fall of the wall, communism, which became more important than the issues around Islam. Okay? Whereas these are European issues as well. So what is politics of memory? What is the remembering and forgetting? What we forget, what we remember. Sometimes forgetting also is a way of refuting events. So in that sense, the second one, this is politics of memory. Second one is anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Sorry to put them in coupling, but it is important because there is also ways of thinking them together or against one each other. And now there is also a very important change when I say it is becoming a marker between Europe and Islam. It is a way of getting rid of European anti-Semitism and putting it on the shoulders of migrants, although I don't want to say that they are not anti-Semit, but you cannot just get rid of the whole past saying that this is all about Islam. But especially what is changing is right-wing neo-populist movements all over Europe is taking over and changing their agenda in relation to Islam. And here again, more they put in their agenda, issues of Islam, the three issues that I have enumerated: construction of mosques, they were the ones who really mobilized against in Switzerland but everywhere else, veiling and halal food, and they changed the profile. The old generation of right-wing neo-populists, I don't know how to name them better, was basically patriarchal, anti-Semit, homophobic, right? Today, they are feminist. They claim to be feminist, pro-Israeli, and Islamophobe. And the best example is to have you in your mind is the difference between Marine Le Pen in France and his daughter Marine Le Pen and the father Le Pen. Father was anti-Semit, patriarchal, and anti-feminist, and homophobic. And the daughter is, on the contrary, pro-Israel, feminist, secularist, republicanist, and what else? And for the homosexuality as well. So the right wing is changing their agenda in relation to Islam and assimilating also the question of Judaism or as a source of European identity. This is my last point. It is the European identity I started debating. The first thing is we have already witnessed the declaration of the end of multiculturalism as a way of thinking difference, but also as now more and more the Judeo-Christian origins of Europe. So this is the interesting move that we are having, how Europe is defined, not in terms of three monotheisms, but how it is Judeo-Christian Europe. And I think this new hyphenated identity, assimilation the tentative of assimilating the Judaic tradition to Europe is also in relation to the exclusion of Islam. Of course, we can be very happy that Judaism is included, but if this is instrumentalized to exclude Islam, it is a problem. So I think there's different ways of thinking these differences, but certainly I think there is some kind of disruptive effect of Islam in today's publics and politics. Thank you very much.
There are so many theses in what you said that I'm sure we're going to have a discussion. Sir.
Just to make some points to try to bring us together.
But concisely.
2 minutes, not
Okay.
more. Remember, what democracy is defined in North America is not what you were talking about. Because democracy in North America, where we have the same problem, comes out in a different piece. For instance, the laws of Ontario and Quebec in Canada have gone positively on the books, anti-Sharia. Anti-Sharia. Number 2, social change is a problem anywhere. And what you're really talking about, it was interesting, I found it absolutely fascinating to hear you talk about redefining the left and the right. We've been doing that for the last 80, 90 years, and I suppose if we would go back, the last more than that. Social lag is a serious problem. We don't know how to overcome it. And that's, I believe, what you're saying. We all are in one position. Events change, and therefore how do we catch up, or how do we operate within that new position? Thank you.
Let's take that first question then in a minute. Okay.
I would like to ask you about the latter part of your lecture about the politics of memory. And I wonder if we're now dealing with the psychology of memory, and I'll give you 2 examples. One is the Turkish Prime Minister, who is now trying to restore Turkey to the glory of the 16th century under Suleiman the Magnificent, when he's naming the operation after an admiral, a famous admiral in the 16th century, whose name was a misnomer anyway, because it was taken from his brother and was given by Europeans. And the second is the Armenian tragedy, as you pointed out, and the inability, not just refusal, but the inability of the Turkish leadership to accept that there was a genocide. So you have 2 cases of very serious distortions of memory and inability to deal with the past.
Why don't you respond to those 2 and then we'll go on.
I haven't understood the anti-Sharia, but Sharia is becoming a very important issue in Canada, but also in England, in Great Britain as well. And there was a big debate in Great Britain when Archbishop of Canterbury, for instance, have said we can accommodate some Sharia laws to British law. And there was a very important outburst of nationalism saying that British law, nothing else. So that's why I'm saying that in Europe, in relation to these debates, French is not exceptionalism, but almost all countries, even the most liberal, pragmatic country like Britain, is going back to these sources of nationalism. So I think it is not the most intelligent way of dealing with it. That's what I'm saying. If it's a social lag, I don't know, but it's also a question of perception of the other. Okay, so I think the ways we are dealing with Islamic presence in Europe, coming back to our nationalist feelings, is not the most intelligent way. It turns against the European Union, which, in my mind, is one of the most exciting political projects in the contemporary world, trying to go beyond the national sense of belonging. So you spoke about distortions of memory in Turkey and inability to accept the genocide. Yes, I said that because it is it is not an easy affair. And I think, again, seeing it from Israel, there are, again, some ironies of history, because Turks counted on the Israeli lobby in the United States not to pass the recognition of Armenian genocide. And now Israeli, I think it is Mr. Lieberman, who is threatening Turkey, saying that we will impose, we will work against the Turkish interest now in our lobby. So things change in time. So it was also in the interest of Israeli not to recognize the Armenian genocide. And I have seen now for the last 2 years, Israeli people are also saying this is not fair. We should also not put a blockage for the non-recognition of the Armenian genocide. So that's why I'm saying it is at the heart of these matters, not only for Turks, but also for Israeli people and for the Europeans as well. The difficulty for Turks to recognize the Armenian genocide, apart from their short-sightedness and this regime of nationalism about forgetting everything related with the bad sides of the history, and especially because Armenian issue was at the heart of this transition from Ottoman multi-ethnic empire to a nation-state building. So there was one more reason not to cope with it easily. But also this being scared to be identified with Nazi Germany. And I must say that I understand the feelings of my compatriots in a way, because almost as if we have discussed the German Nazi as particular accident of modernity, in the case of Ottoman Turks, people think it's almost natural, it's a natural outcome of their barbarianism. So I think we should also contextualize it and discuss. I'm fully agree that we shouldn't have any distortions of memory, but there's no way of full truth. This is all about ongoing processes of learning and remembering.
Over there.
Yes, first of all, thank you for your presentation, but I think it's an audiovisual film.
Ah, good.
Not only visual. It's a four-legged chair. Yes, these are minarets, and slaughtering, but the fourth pillar is language. The issue of language nowadays, of immigrants, the issue of language, how would the European state face the immigrants? How the immigrants face the European state? What language they talk? What language we demand them to forget, and what language we demand them to acquire? This is a major issue nowadays in Europe between the European state and Muslim immigrants.
Yes, first I thank you saying this is a film and audiovisual, because without showing any films, I hope that you had some visual in your head. So this is the first thing. The audio, yes, I say they are shifting back and forth between several languages, but this was Europe, polyglot. Since when we think that we have only one language community? It was a nation state. So I think the issue is how to learn and teach several languages. And this is becoming politics as well. For Germans, they impose, for example, Turks coming to Germany to start learning German already in Turkey, and they are building up institutions for that. Of course, language is an important issue, but I am for speaking several issues, and if possible, to keep the old Jewish accent even when they speak several European languages, whereas we Turks try to speak the language without the accent, this mimetism. It's always important. So I'm against all kinds of assimilation, as you can hear.
Michael.
Two minor comments, which only to stress some continuity with Venice as a radical break as a result of the impact and challenge of Islam. These very minor, but perhaps somewhat significant. First of all, those of us who remember the origins of the European Union may remember that the beginning was in the 50s, two separate unions, which were called the 6 and the 7. And the interesting thing about the 6 and the 7 that latently, it was never made completely explicit. The 6, namely Benelux, Western Germany, and France, of course, were largely Catholic. But the 7, which were an economic looser union,
FTA.
was a looser union of Protestant countries, England, Portugal, in fact, it's a bit extraordinary about the Scandinavian countries, or at least largely Protestant. And what I want to point out is simply that
religion has played a certain role in the process of European unification all along, although not always explicitly so. I don't know whether that's the European Union as it stands now is an indication of the transcending of confessional division. To what extent it will be able to transcend Christian versus Islamic separation is, of course, an open question, but I think that religion has been there implicitly all along. And the second, again, very minor point concerning dietary laws and slaughter laws, I think it's important to mention the fact that in Switzerland, of course, slaughtering is prohibited and has always been prohibited by the authorities. This is not a completely new thing. On the basis of, and the writers on, in Switzerland, you could not perform forced slaughter.
Do you want to take another one, or do you want to do that one?
I want to add to that, yes. That's why I think the mirroring between the past and the Jewish issues, because there are many, some kind of possibilities of mirroring with the present history of Muslim migrants is interesting. So in Switzerland, yes, that's a good example, but Switzerland considered itself outside Europe and entered into the European debates with the referendum of the ban. So how you become European is interesting, because the Denmark also with the cartoon controversy entered into the European public sphere. So sometimes these marginal countries enter. So there is a kind of changing of the mapping of European countries. So the period you are referring is also basically Germany and France. So European Union was thought in terms of getting beyond the animosity between Germany and France, and therefore it was very much thought as a peace project for that generation, how to create peace and leave the war behind. So it's still thought basically as Germany and France as the main actors. So Britain as insular countries, Switzerland totally outside, Denmark, I mean, some kind of Nordic cold countries. So the mapping is changing in relation to Islam. That's what I'm saying. Islam brings forth these countries into the Europeanness. There's a new cartography. And if we think in historical terms, there is this author who has written there are three civilizational heritages on Europe, he would remind us. One is Western Christian, but the other one is Soviet Union, Byzantium and Soviet Union, and the third one, Ottoman Islamic, he would say. And so with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it is again this Soviet, ex-Soviet countries which entered, and now is transforming this total outlook of Europe and bringing a new mapping, because maybe the countries that we considered more at the periphery will be more and more decisive in the formation of Europe. But today the confrontation is basically with the heritage of Islamic Ottoman in Europe as well. We can think in these terms of clusters of civilization, although these civilization doesn't exist anymore. But some residual effects might be playing still on the European grounds.
Yes.
I'd like to ask about integration of immigration and the difference between Islam and Judaism. I think France is a good example. It has a long tradition of immigration, but most immigrants, Italian, Portuguese, Yugoslav, they wanted to become French. Jews were a kind of exception. They remain Jews, but they remain Jews as private, but in public space they want to become French. With Islam, I have the feeling that it's not sure that they want to become really French. And one of the problems is, for instance, the institutional framework, because Jews became to be part of a consistoire which is regulated by the state, which the Islamic community refused. I don't know why exactly, because it has to do with Dar al or what exactly.
The regulation, you mean?
No, because for Jews, they were accepted since Napoleon. They made part, as being different within the framework of the Republic of France. But the Islamic community isn't willing to accept this formula.
I think, first, Islamic community is not a community. There is such a diversity. You have Algerian origin, so there is this colonial past with Algeria, where the laws of secularism was not applied to Algeria, for instance, okay, in different ways, codes of citizenship. And, but there are also different migrants coming from different origins, so there is not one possibility of a institutional representative of Islam.
They said with Jews from Alsace,
Yeah.
from Poland, from Algeria, but still.
Yeah, I don't know if I have difficulty of thinking that this history was successful for Jews, although I don't think that the history is being successful for Muslims neither. But this assimilation, it is true that Muslims making their difference visible resist assimilation, that's for sure. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's because it is the essence of Islam, some would say, or it is in the l'air du temps, because we know that assimilation has its limits. Nobody wants to be assimilated. I can start with feminists. Feminists, instead of being like a man, human being, they refuse to be assimilated, right? And they said, we are women in a different way. We don't want to be thought as in this universalist category of human being, because it would always mean for us less than a male human being, right? And I think there is this logic for Muslims as well. They can never be fully accepted. Look at the Algerians. You cannot be more French than Algerians. They are coming from French schools. They speak the language, and most of them, elites at least, they don't speak Arabic. And among migrants, there are many who doesn't speak Arabic. They only start sometimes learning Arabic when they become more pious and Islamic. Through Quranic courses, they try to relearn Arabic. And so the Algerians do have problems in France. Moroccans have less, although they are less assimilated. So there are colonial background problems, and I don't think that sometimes making yourself invisible helps, because always there is this name, date of birth, there is something which reminds of this small difference which might become a hindrance for equal access and can be a stigmatization.
Over there, gentleman in the last row.
I like very much your remarks on identity, on your own identity as a Turk. Could you briefly comment what is going on in your country, in Turkey?
Oh, quickly.
Secular, proud of being secular, and how Turkey is coping with the visibility of Islam or religion as such in the public sphere.
Well, this is a real challenge to make it in a nutshell. How is I think it is true that the visibility of religion for Turks, that is for a Muslim majority country, was as shocking as it is for Europeans. So that's, for me, was very interesting. When I moved from Istanbul to Paris, I thought I was leaving behind me all these debates on Islamic veiling, and I wanted to work on multiple modernities between India, Turkey, and China. And then I came to France, and I found myself in the midst of all these debates on Islam, veiling, and, well, this made me think in a, again, ironical way, saying, aha, the sense of history is changing, because when one thinks, one moves towards the West, one is in a land of unknown creativity, that is Europe. Whereas for me, when I moved from Turkey to France, it was familiar. It was like encountering Islam and Turkey in France, in Europe. So it's almost like the clockwise sense of progress of history changed. So you can learn from Turkey. You can learn from East. So the debates on Islam in Turkey for me, is in advance to help us to understand. That's why I grasped really the public controversies in Europe quicker than anybody, quicker than my friends, because I witnessed and I experienced it in Turkey. So the headscarf in the university campuses created a kind of panic, public panic in Turkey. And it could have really created a military coup in the Turkish case. Of course, every time there is anxiety over Islam, there is military intervention every 10 years to stop this Islamization. Okay? So secularism was always thought as something which can stop Islamization by means of military intervention. I think this vicious circle is now maybe coming to an end. That is, you have democratization, which means carrying more Islam to the public sphere, but then this make secular elites fear that they are going to be overthrown, so there is the military intervention. Okay, I make a very complex story less complex. So Erdogan government represents this tradition of conservative Democrats since 1950s. They are not coming from nowhere. They are not just Islamists. They are coming from the conservative Democrats who were alternating with Republican secular elites, Menderes period. So this, but Erdogan is coming from a much more Islamic homogeneous group. That is the difference. In comparison with Özal period. I don't know if you know the names. Turgut Özal. Already Turgut Özal was considered as a fundamentalist in the minds of secular people. So this secular divide with more conservative Democrat divide is deepened in one way, but at the same time the wall between secular Turks and religious became more porous. You see what I mean? So there are many secular intellectuals, Democrats, writing in, for instance, religious newspapers. They can be even of Armenian origin. There's a very well-known intellectual, Etienne Mahçupyan, who is Armenian from left. He's writing in a religious newspaper called Zaman. So, I mean, this wouldn't be really imagined in Turkey because we were all separate. We didn't even shake hands between the secular and the religious Turkey. So this is no longer the case. People are getting acquainted with each other much more. And that's why he became so popular. The issue is, the complexity is, there is this dismantling of what we call the deep state, the courts of Ergenekon, trying to show that some of the killings and were related with intellectuals and so violent attacks were made in order to destabilize the system, to justify a military regime to overthrow the AKP, the government in power. But in the eyes of some, this is democratization, cleaning up. In the eyes of others, this is more Islamization. So there's a real battle also of perceptions. I'm an optimist person. I believe, I hope we are on the way of deepening of democracy with some kind of problems in the region, especially with Israel. And I think we should create the tandem once again. If Turkey loses this power of mediator and makes part of one camp, one identity, it will be a total failure. One of the One of the mottos of this government with the Davutoğlu's being the foreign minister was zero problem with our neighbors. So this was a vision, but this turns out to be just its contrary. This will be a catastrophe. So.
Okay, I have right now 4 people on the list, and you're fourth. Okay, you're first, I'm second, then Nono, then you, and then we'll see who else. Okay, why don't you start? You, yes.
Oh. I think my question is already answered, but what I want to mention is what about Atatürk's system and so on.
That's the question. What about Atatürk's system in what way? What are you?
Yes, I understood.
You understood, okay.
Yes. Well, I think It is highly criticized today as the word, I like that you mentioned Atatürk and not Kemalism, because Kemalism is frightening. It's this ideology where military power and so-called progressist intellectuals came together to overthrow the Democratic Party. That's how I would put Kemalism. Okay. But Atatürk's system means this sense of belonging to the Western world with a secular state and what else? And civil code, legal system which is totally secular. And I think the party today in government, I cannot say it is totally against, because even the membership for European Union means it is the continuation of the project. I can answer in a nutshell. Because this party was really trying to make the reforms so that Turkey be member of the European Union, means that it is still on the agenda. It is not overthrowing. We shouldn't think in terms of alternance, that is, if there is Islam, then it's the end of secularism. I think the word post-secularism means there is a new ways of articulation between the two. But certainly there is a loss of the hegemony of the secular. But it doesn't mean that there is the hegemony of the Islamic. That is the difference. We thought in terms of one leading to the hegemony of the other. This was the Iranian Revolution. This is the mindset created after Iranian Revolution. Failure of secularism in this region, so therefore Islamic state. Whereas in the Turkish case, the society became very heterogeneous and very multi-layered with civil society. One doesn't precede with other, but it is cohabitation.
I'm next on my list, and I have a bunch of points to make. First of all, about Europe and the identity of Europe. I and my wife were at a conference where the Europeans, about this precise issue about 5, 6 years ago, where the Europeans said that what had united them in common was places where Latin had been spoken. In other words, they had a great problem with the Balkans, but none with Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Hungary. And this Latin definition I thought was interesting to think about. The second point is about the question where you said the moving border between the private and the public. Now, in German, there are really three things, because there's the public, there's the Privatsphäre, and by that they mean the family, and they don't mean the private self. And the private self, they mean the Intimsphäre, which is called the intimate. And it's noticeable that the private then becomes a social term, and very often we, like people like myself who grew up in the United States, think of the private as the intimate, and don't distinguish between the two. And of course the intimate for them is a sphere without norms, as opposed to us growing up in the United States, where it has to be the most regulated sphere of all, because the polity is based on the regulation of the private self. That leads me to the third point about why you recognized France. And I would suggest it's because you came from one place where there was a centralized secular state facing a traditional religion to another, and we have that in our country too, because when I talk to young people who are in elite high schools, say the upper middle class of Israelis, what I see are very often anti-democratic secular Kemalists. Mm-hmm. In other words, they want a military intervention, and against whom? Against the ultra-Orthodox. That's the people they really resent. Not the Palestinians, that's just a normal sort of thing. But the ultra-Orthodox are worth giving up for a while on democracy to clean house. And I think that's an interesting thing, because it reminds me of the same situation in Turkey, in Argentina, and as opposed to that, then you have a sort of right-wing neo-populism, which you're beginning to even see in the United States.
Yes.
And this
Tea Party,
Tea Party, which is this Sarah Palin, which is exactly the same phenomenon, in a way, pallid American variation of Juan Domingo Perón, and all this kind of stuff. So I think that you see this, that where the elite then is, quote, secular, not so liberal anymore, then the people very often are then neo-populist and anti-elitist in that way. Up to there.
Thank you. This is very, I believe. Now, first, I think it's interesting to see what is intimate, and is it how you define the intimate. And I think there is this in the religious self, it is monitored as well. There is always this surveillance. Fate is not something given once for all and fixed. You have to surveiller and discipline yourself. When you speak with really pious people, they have to check it on if they are really good Muslims or not, if they have been good enough observant today, how they have done their prayer, were they really concentrated, and so on. So it's a continuous inner voice, this inner voice. And then it becomes also sometimes public in a working place when you want to make your prayer, and when you put on the headscarf, then you become visible to some of your colleagues that you wouldn't like to be recognized as a Muslim, because suddenly they see you, they would tell me, and then they are seen as a Muslim, which creates some problems. So I think this intimate self and public, there are ways of, there are many levels, it's true. And I fully agree with your political analysis, is that this Kemalist way of seeing things, that it is worth giving up democracy, so not to have these ultra-Orthodox or Islamist people. It is widely now shared. It is not only in Turkey, but also in European countries that we have this point of view, yes.
No.
Thank you. I would like you to, I would like to clarify one aspect of what you said at the beginning of the perspective of what do you think about the comparison between Turkey and Europe. Because for the long term, in fact, you to a certain extent distinguish these two discourses. But when you describe what's going on in Turkey at the beginning, you said on the one hand that what can be seen as desecularization, perhaps, or is in fact the return of to many aspects of suppressed generations, the imaging side, but also recognition of minorities. And then strikingly, you said there are the destructive elements of Islam when you mentioned these issues. But
Disruptive, not destructive. I said disruptive. Yeah.
Destructive.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, good. Now, then you continue talking about Europe, and then in order to provide, suggest an alternative kind of understanding of secularism, let's say secularism. So, do you think that when we now try to link what you said about Turkey, critically, but basically, what you said about Turkey and about Europe, we can think about what's going on in Turkey, which to a certain extent, strikingly, I think, very similar to some trends in Israel. The return to the suppressed, the denial of the distinction between religious and secular people. The turn of what is not known here as conservative Democrats, but maybe can be seen as conservative Democrats, as an alternative, a common alternative to European understanding, Christian European understanding of secularism.
Yes, I think what is going on, this is also taking the question that you were asking, the ways Islam is becoming part of the public space, although not yet self-presentation of Turks, because the government and the Erdogan government, until now, both in their campaigns and in their political vocabulary, have not used a openly, overtly religious discourse. They are pious, and we can know it from their wives, because the wives are having the headscarf. But they have not made campaigns in relation to a kind of Islamic idiom, right? So we cannot. That's important. They are not putting the issue of Islam in the forefront. But still, when you see the Somali, for instance, this was the first thing. I think there is some kind of sense of solidarity and so on, and in relation to Palestinian case also. So some people fear that there is a more sense of belonging to that cluster than before. And although they first tried to be more as a mediator, they positioned themselves as mediator. But since the history of Gaza, when with Israel, it's getting, so that's why Israeli politics is also becoming very decisive on Turkey. We shouldn't think that Turkey is just a player, inclusive player on its own. who were saying, no, a friend of us in the seminar was saying that we shouldn't take Turkey as if it is totally opaque and not in interaction with other countries. So this relationship with Israel will put Turkey into a different position. Okay? This will change the whole thing as it changes with the Arabic world. This is something new. We are entering into a zone of accelerated change for Turkey. That's what I tried to bring forth. This was, I mean, in the 1970s when I was in this youth camp, it was unthinkable. And that, I mean, unthinkable that Turkey and the Arabic world and against Israel, this was unthinkable. Until very recently, this was unthinkable. Although maybe you would say that many popular classes would have felt much more in sympathy with Palestinians and so on, but the system was in a way that not only a kind of regime, but also middle classes thought in these terms. And but Turkey is no longer totally in the Western, it's getting autonomous. That's how I'll put it. There is this autonomization of Turkey. It started with the Iraq War, and it started in a very democratic way. Democratic in the sense of the motion that didn't pass in the parliament. Why democratic? It was open vote. And it was 50-50. The motion that gave the permission to American troops to use the Turkish soil. And I think this was a really turning point for Turkish politics. For the first time, Turkey took a distance from American politics. Although it was not determined, it was not thought in advance. The government didn't want it. All my friends were against that. They all wanted Turkey to be part of this politics, American, like the first Gulf War. And all my friends were almost crying, saying this is the end of Turkey, because Europe will not embrace us. And if we are not allied with America, we are now with all enemies around us. It's the end of Turkey. Really, people thought about it, and many people. But this was 50-50, and people thought this was not just war, the Iraqi war, and also the implication of Turkey in Iraq would open up the Pandora box, and we will find ourselves in a terrible situation, fighting against our neighbors and Muslims and so on. So first thing, it was Iraq war, and it is a very, very important moment. And second, the narrative of Turks, I'm saying, is Erdogan was with the Israeli government on the Syrian, as a Syrian mediator for the Syria. And the next day was the Gaza occupation. And I think he didn't forget this, okay? He didn't forget this. And so the mediator role, so that's why what you do with a country can have an impact on you in spite of your intentions. History is made sometimes, that's why I'm a sociologist, and this is the best thing I like about sociology. It's not about all texts and beliefs and opinions. There are unintended consequences of action. There are unintended consequences. So this one vote, the difference of one vote in the parliament, had a series of unprecedented, unintended consequences for Turkey. And the same for European Union. Okay, so Turkey felt herself distanced and had to change the mindset. It is not that Islamists came and changed it. That's not true. So this government was with the Europe and with the American, being the American ally. They couldn't imagine themselves putting a distance with America until the Iraq war. And they didn't force it. It was the parliamentary vote. Army wanted, government wanted. It was a public opinion. Yeah. One difference of vote. And I think it changed the whole spectrum. And so what is going on with Israel will change it as well. So I think we are interacting, and it can change also Israel. Okay, so I think we should think about these issues not as international politics, but making part of our ways of redefining these clusters of sense of belonging. For instance, Turkey made tried to make an agreement, a kind of tandem with Brazil against Iranian, to control the Iranian nuclear weapons. I found it very important. Why? Because this was not among Muslims. Okay? This was, if we want other players in the global world, we have to accept other players in the global world. Okay? So Turkey is becoming autonomous. Autonomous means it's also open to dangers. You can make mistakes because once it is already given as a blueprint of the United States and Israel, it's easy. Once you do not follow the blueprint, what is going to happen is very interactive. So I don't think it's about religion only, what's going on, right? But Turkey is discovering, in a way, its Ottoman heritage, which is true. With its bad sides, I said, with its good sides. It's not related with Islam, the massacres, genocides. It's related with nationalism. It's the Jeune Turk government. So don't misunderstand me. Armenian, there shouldn't be an optical transformation. It is the Armenian issue and the exchanges of population with Greeks and tax imposition on Jews, and there are many things. The confiscation of properties. The story is not only rose and nice things about it. It's all but related with the rise of nationalism. What I find interesting in the Turkish case with AKP, secular became more nationalist, and what we call conservative became less nationalist. So these tensions with Israel, I would be very scared that it will push them to be more nationalist. That would be my...
The religious Turks.
Yeah, because the religious Turks, contrary to what people thought, didn't become more nationalist. Because secular became more nationalist. That is the interesting thing. They are anti-European, they are more nationalist, whereas AKP is much more open. So that's why they are the ones who recognize non-minority rights. They give the property to non-Muslim minorities now, turning back the property that was confiscated in the 70s, I think. The film Shoah Landsman will be shown in Turkish state television. It's programmed. So it is. So I cannot say that it is becoming a non-tolerant country. I cannot say that. This would not be, on the contrary, this will not be honest. Okay? I think it's a country where these things are debated. But going back to this, for me the danger will be this nationalist, jerky, protectionist movements.
The gentleman okay.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was the end.
Islamization.
Can you, excuse me, I can't hear.
Are there signs of increase in procreation, as happens in many other Islamic countries? And concomitantly, is there kind of a trend of the diminishing in contribution and devotion to science and advancement of knowledge, as Bernard Lewis and others would claim?
No. On the contrary, the procreation falls in a drastic way in Turkey, except for Kurds. So Kurds are the migrants. There are some mirrorings with Israel. You know, some people would say, you have your Palestinians, we have your Kurds. Turks were thinking in much more sympathy with Israel, terrorism issues, so in this sense. So no, it's on the contrary, the population is in decrease. And universities, we have more now private universities than in France and anywhere. It's science and everything is in, the development is in much more, the rate of development is increasing.
Well,
Yes.
I think the real question is where you have secular humanities. What?
He didn't say about prosperity. It is a very prosperous country became Turkey in the last 20 years.
It's a very prosperous country. Things are changed, and I have the feeling I go in the wrong direction. That is, Europe is going down. And so I'm always missing the opportunities.
You have to
But
go back to the
I have to go back. The moment all these private universities blossomed in Turkey, I went to a public university in France, and we are having big problems in France in every sense. And I'm amazed at every day, because we had in mind that the Western world, France, was ahead. So, and Turkey is very prosperous, very, very prosperous, but it is in this entering into a accelerated history. That's how I should put it.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful evening. Very insightful talk. Now we'll go have dinner.
Thank you.
Yeah.